We're going to be discussing 20 hormones today, 6 neuropeptides, and then talking about the different glands that secrete each of them and their general behavioral effects, the responses. We start off drawing a curved W and labeling it as the hypothalamus. When it comes down to it, the hypothalamus is pretty much in charge of most endocrine responses. So we have our hypothalamus, the infundibulum, which is the stalk, and then that leads to the pituitary. We're actually going to start off taking a look at the posterior pituitary lobe, which is innervated directly from the hypothalamus through neural tissue. The posterior pituitary lobe is not actually a gland. It wouldn't be called the posterior pituitary gland, for example. The posterior pituitary lobe instead is made of neural tissue and neuroglia, supportive tissues, and its job is actually to release 2 hormones that are created within the hypothalamus. So again, the posterior pituitary lobe does not actually itself manufacture any hormones. It simply releases substances that were created within the hypothalamus. So one of the advantages then to having a structure outside of the hypothalamus releasing this stuff is that it can actually have a blood supply, which the hypothalamus does not specifically have. So we send an arteriole in, the inferior hypophyseal artery, and we're going to create a little capillary bed there and a little venule leaving out. And this is how these hormones are actually released from this structure. So first of all, we have the hormone oxytocin, a pretty well-known hormone. It's responsible for a number of things in the body, but the main things it's known for is uterine contraction during labor and bonding between mother and baby, and even between people who are in love with each other. The next one is ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, which is responsible for water retention. We're going to be speaking about this later on when we discuss the urinary system. So the posterior pituitary lobe, again, secretes 2 substances created by the hypothalamus, oxytocin and ADH. All right, next we're going to go ahead and draw our pancreas here. So our pancreas has 2 different types of cells. It actually has other release structures as well. The endocrine release that we're discussing today is about 10% of the substance secretion by the pancreas. There are 2 types of cells, alpha cells and beta cells, both found within pancreatic islets. And the alpha cells create a hormone called glucagon, which is responsible for elevating your blood glucose levels. And the beta cells release a well-known hormone called insulin, which is responsible for decreasing your blood glucose levels when they are too high. The next type of gland we're going to be discussing is the parathyroid glands, but in order to draw them, we're actually going to go ahead and draw our thyroid glands first. So we're going to go to the other corner of the paper here. We're going to draw a trachea, which is your windpipe, and then wrapped around the trachea, we have the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland looks much like a small butterfly and kind of put some upside down little V's on there to indicate it is glandular tissue. We label this the thyroid gland, and we're going to go ahead and label the trachea as well. Now this is an anterior perspective of the trachea, which is a little more recognizable, and I wanted to show this because when we look at the back side of the trachea, which we're drawing over here, the back side or the posterior side of the trachea is not as recognizable. What happens in the front, in the anterior portion, is that we have these strong cartilaginous rings, but on the back side, on the posterior edge, they do not close all the way. So when we draw the posterior trachea, we're drawing kind of an open cartilaginous rings in the back, and that's your posterior trachea. So here we're looking at the posterior side of sort of the edges of the thyroid gland. But what's most important for this structure is drawing those parathyroid glands. So there's between 3 and 6 attached to the thyroid gland. We usually draw 4. So inside the parathyroid glands, we have chief cells, and they secrete a hormone called PTH, or parathyroid hormone. And the responsibility of parathyroid hormone is to increase your blood calcium levels when they get too low, an absolutely essential function. We're going to go back to our hypothalamus, and we're going to take a look at our neuropeptides. So neuropeptides are not quite hormones, they're not quite neurotransmitters, they're sort of a different class of substances. They're secreted by the hypothalamus, and then they're going to make their way down this stalk called the infundibulum and into the anterior pituitary gland, which we're going to be discussing in a moment. For now, let's go ahead and list out our neuropeptides. We have GHRH and GHIH, which stands for growth hormone releasing hormone and growth hormone inhibiting hormone. We then have TRH, CRH, GnRH, and PIH. Now, growth hormone releasing hormone and growth hormone inhibiting hormone both have an interaction in the anterior pituitary gland, where they're going to interact with the release or the inhibition of release of growth hormone. So the dotted arrow there means that it is inhibiting its release. And it may sound strange to say, oh, okay, well, we have one substance secreted from the hypothalamus that enhances the release of growth hormone and another one that inhibits the release of growth hormone. But in fact, the hypothalamus isn't just one structure, it's a number of different nuclei inside of there, and there are different structures that sometimes release substances that have opposite meanings, they have opposite purposes. Let's go ahead and discuss TRH. TRH, released by the hypothalamus, will cause the release of TSH, which is released by the anterior pituitary gland. TRH is called thyrotropin releasing hormone, and TSH is thyroid stimulating hormone. CRH causes the release of ACTH, that's corticotropin releasing hormone, causes the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone. GnRH causes the release of two different gonadotropins called LH and FSH. GnRH stands for gonadotropin releasing hormone, and LH stands for luteinizing hormone, and FSH for follicle stimulating hormone. Lastly, we have PIH, which inhibits the release of PRL. PIH stands for prolactin inhibiting hormone, and as the name suggests, it inhibits the release of prolactin. We're going to actually explore that story a little bit more right now by kind of following the pathway of this, and then all the other substances, all those other neuropeptides work in a similar way, and we're going to be discussing more examples in a moment, but we're going to follow this one story so it's kind of clear how this kind of a situation occurs. So we start off with PIH, which is one of the neuropeptides produced in the hypothalamus. It's going to follow a specific blood flow, which we're going to be discussing in a moment, into the anterior pituitary gland, and it's going to cause the release from the anterior pituitary gland of a substance called PRL, or prolactin. When the prolactin is released into the blood supply, then it's going to target breast tissue, and specifically breast secretory tissue, which I'm going to draw now. I'm going to draw a few representations of the duct system that make their way through the breast. And so there are specific glandular ducts that allow for the production and then secretion of milk. And so this is lactation. Now, as you can imagine, you don't want to be lactating on a regular basis. So the fact that we have an inhibitory connection means that outside of very specific times during your life, you will not be lactating, because unless the inhibition is released, for example, if the hypothalamus ceases to release PIH, then PRL will not be secreted, if that makes sense. So under conditions when you want to begin lactating, the hypothalamus ceases to create PIH. Therefore, PRL, prolactin, begins to be secreted by the anterior pituitary gland, which in turn enters into the bloodstream, targets this breast secretory tissue, and then you produce milk. But under normal circumstances, the hypothalamus is basically constantly throughout your lifetime releasing prolactin inhibiting hormone, PIH, and therefore you do not produce prolactin in the anterior pituitary gland on a regular basis. Well, we're going to take a closer look at that infundibulum, because it turns out there is a blood supply that is quite important that connects the output of the hypothalamus with the anterior pituitary gland. So first of all, we're going to draw our superior hypophyseal artery, which you'll notice kind of punctures right into the infundibulum, very close to the hypothalamus. All those important neuropeptides that we listed are actually going to enter the blood supply through there. And then there's going to be a series of veins that are going to make their way through the infundibulum and through the anterior pituitary gland. Now the anterior pituitary gland then is going to have all these blood vessels that receive all of these neuropeptides circulate through, and then this causes in turn the release of all those important, oftentimes tropic hormones or maintenance hormones from the anterior pituitary gland. So here we go. We label the anterior pituitary gland our adenohypophysis, the adenohypophysis. And let's label our plexuses, our plexi. We have our primary capillary plexus, which is the capillary bed up above at the top of the infundibulum. And actually, the blood vessels that make their way through the anterior pituitary gland are called the secondary capillary plexus. The word plexus means networking or crisscrossing of something. So it turns out this is kind of an unusual situation. There's only two places in the body where we have two capillary beds actually connected with each other. And it's a little unusual situation because usually when you have a capillary bed, it goes from red to blue, as the primary capillary plexus does there. It goes from arterial to venule, and oxygenated to deoxygenated blood. And then what happens is that blood is eventually sent to larger and larger veins and eventually back to the heart. So it's a little unusual to have a capillary bed connected by veins to another capillary bed. There is one other place in the body where we have this, and it's called the hepatic portal system, which is the portal system that is involved with the liver. But this is the other one, at least that I know of. This is the only other one, and this particular one is called the hypophyseal portal system, or the hypophyseal portal vein. So again, our primary capillary plexus is connected with our secondary capillary plexus, basically two capillary beds connected with each other through these portal veins, the word portal meaning door or doorway between two things. And so this is how the neuropeptides released from the hypothalamus are able to eventually circulate through the anterior pituitary gland. Well, once they circulate through, they are going to in turn cause the release of all of these hormones, including prolactin and all the other things listed over there. And therefore, we have to have a way to get those things into the blood supply. So we get them into the blood supply through the anterior hypophyseal vein, which is our last little tiny thing that we are going to go ahead and label over there. All right, so we're going to go ahead and start then discussing other hormones that are released from the anterior pituitary gland in response to those neurohormones secreted by the hypothalamus. And so the next one we're going to be discussing is GH, or growth hormone. And for this, the easiest story is we're going to talk about the growth of long bones. When we think about growth hormone, usually we're thinking about a substance that makes a person grow taller or forms the ability for long bones to get longer through that epiphyseal plate or that growth plate. And so there's a targeting directly from the growth hormone, actually through an intermediary called IGF, which is secreted by the liver, and that then in turn causes growth. Just so you know, there's other things that growth hormone does, including increasing your blood glucose. But that growth story is kind of an interesting one because, in fact, you can use growth hormone to make your have appositional growth of your bones throughout your lifetime, the horizontal growth, rather than lengthening. The lengthening is only going to happen for about 18 to 20 years. And after that, the epiphyseal plate is closed. But after that time, you can still use growth hormone, for example, to make your muscles larger or your bones wider and things like that. So there's other reasons why we secrete growth hormone throughout our lifetime. All right, so the next on the list of hormones that are secreted by the anterior pituitary gland would be TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone. As the name suggests, it causes the release of thyroid hormone from the thyroid gland. Let's take a closer look at the thyroid gland itself. We're going to be looking at a follicle here, and the follicle is filled with a substance called colloid, which is almost like a fatty substance. But the purpose of colloid is to store iodine, I2. And the follicle is going to be surrounded by cells, which are called follicular cells. And then there's also a different set of cells called parafollicular cells. So let's go ahead and label those. I should say this is the only reason I know of inside of your body why it is that you need iodine in your diet, why we have things like iodized salts, to ensure that we have plenty of iodine present in order to attach to thyroid hormone. Okay, so we have our follicular cells, we have our parafollicular cells, the root para meaning next to or around something. The follicular cells are the ones that actually secrete the very famous thyroid hormone, also called T3 or T4, depending on the number of iodines attached. 3 iodines attached is T3, 4 iodines attached is T4. Thyroid hormone is your major metabolic hormone. It basically has a ubiquitous target. Every cell of your body has receptors for thyroid hormone because they all require thyroid hormone in order to work properly, in order to metabolize. All right, the parafollicular cells secrete a substance called a hormone called calcitonin, which is responsible for lowering your blood calcium levels under conditions when your blood calcium levels are too high. It's almost never a problem that we have to worry about. Our blood calcium levels do not tend to get very high. Calcitonin is important as a pharmacological agent. Sometimes if a person has overactive osteoclasts, for example, calcitonin can be administered to try to slow that down. All right, our next substance that is secreted by the anterior pituitary gland is going to be ACTH, or Adrenocorticotropic Hormone. And adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, is actually pretty well known. It is going to be interacting with the adrenal gland, adrenal gland. I encourage you to say some of these words out loud to take some of the fear away. It sounds like a massive, complicated word, but it actually breaks down into much simpler pieces. All right, so we're going to go ahead and draw our adrenal glands here. And we've discussed these a few different times now. The adrenal glands in particular, the medulla in particular, we've discussed twice already. And then the cortex is the outer part. So the medulla is the middle, the cortex is the outer part. And as we've discussed previously, the adrenal medulla is going to receive input from the sympathetic nervous system. And the sympathetic nervous system is going to be using cholinergic input to directly synapse with chromaffin cells inside of the medulla. The chromaffin cells, in turn, are going to be creating adrenaline and noradrenaline. And the purpose of adrenaline and noradrenaline is to create the fight, flight, or freeze response. And there are many, many targets of adrenaline, noradrenaline, pretty much all of the things in the body. All right, so let's go ahead and turn back to ACTH there. Although ACTH may have some effects on the adrenal medulla, the main target is the adrenal cortex. It is again called adrenocorticotropic hormone. It is the maintenance hormone that controls the adrenal cortex. And so the purpose of the ACTH is to cause corticosteroid release. And so we're going to go ahead and write corticosteroid inside by the cortex. And we're going to talk about two different corticosteroids that are important to us. The mineralocorticoids, with the main one being aldosterone, is going to cause water retention. Now, we've already discussed another substance that causes water retention in the body, which is ADH. Now, water retention by ADH uses a different means. Aldosterone, the mineralocorticoids, specifically use sodium reabsorption at the level of the kidneys in order to bring water back into the body from what could potentially be released into the urine. So the rule of thumb is where sodium goes, water follows. Where sodium goes, water follows. So when we bring sodium back into the body, it's a really efficient and powerful way of bringing water back into the body as well. Lastly, we have the glucocorticoids, which is our second corticosteroid. The glucocorticoids, we've actually discussed those earlier too, because the main glucocorticoid is cortisol, which we've discussed as a stress hormone, but it also increases your blood glucose levels. You'll notice maybe that at this point we have actually discussed 3 different hormones that increase your blood glucose levels: the glucocorticoids, growth hormone, and glucagon. And there's only one hormone that actually decreases your blood glucose levels: insulin. And the way that insulin works is primarily by increasing the uptake of glucose into the cells. So it's not just a matter of lowering blood levels of glucose, it's a matter of getting the cells to take in the glucose from the blood. And by the way, there are other substances in your body that also help to increase your blood glucose levels. Insulin is a completely non-redundant substance in your body. It's the only one that actually decreases your blood glucose levels, probably pointing to the fact that through much of human history, what we were worried about was starvation and increasing our blood glucose levels. So a lot of our body's hormonal efforts were in that direction. It's only been in the last maybe few hundred years that most of us have had access to so much food that we actually have to worry about high blood glucose levels and decreasing it. With obviously a lot of people have to worry about insulin sensitivity now, or being able to produce enough insulin or produce insulin at all, with various disorders being involved with that. Now, I just wanted to give a little overview here. We've been discussing 4 different hormones that are secreted by the anterior pituitary gland, and we're now going to discuss our last 2. So we've discussed prolactin, growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, and ACTH, and now we're going to be discussing our last 2, what they're actually called gonadotropin hormones, which are luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, LH and FSH. As I said, both of these work as gonadotropins, and their targets we're going to kind of draw off in the corner here. So these gonadotropins have 2 different purposes. Luteinizing hormone mainly works by helping to increase the sex hormone levels. And follicle stimulating hormone mainly works by increasing gamete formation, such as your haploid sperm and your haploid eggs. And so the targets here are going to be your ovaries and your testes, which are homologous structures. So I just went ahead and drew one because they are very, very similar to each other, homologous between men and women. So your ovaries and testes are the target tissue here, the target structures. And the hormones that are going to be released, of course, are estrogen and testosterone, which, by the way, everybody produces both. It's just varying levels, typically between men and women, and also progesterone, which is typically thought of as a female hormone, a female sex hormone. And so our targets here are luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone would be doing a number of things to both of these primary sex organs, or these gonads. Well, we have discussed a lot of things today, and it looks like a lot of information, and in fact it is. I don't find it to be as overwhelming anymore as I did when I first encountered it, but I still remember the first time that I had to, memorize lists and lists of hormones. One of the things you might want to consider is thinking about the fact that there are 20 different hormones listed here in green, and then there are 6 neuropeptides listed in black, and it's likely that you will have to get to know all of them. But I think it's actually doable if you start to think about things in chunks. For example, if you think about all of the hormones that are released in the presence of neural innervation, such as adrenaline and noradrenaline, and actually oxytocin and ADH as well. You could also think of grouping together all of the hormones that are based on humoral regulation, such as glucagon, insulin, PTH, and calcitonin. These are the main ones that we think about that way. And then you could also think about all those tropic hormones. Prolactin is sometimes considered a tropic hormone or a maintenance hormone. Growth hormone actually is a tropic hormone as well. And then we have TSH, ACTH, luteinizing hormone, LH, and FSH. And so, group things together, try to list them out in different ways, and it won't be quite so overwhelming. There are only 20 hormones. You want to consider for each of the hormones, you want to consider what is the gland which releases it, and what is the eventual behavior which that particular hormone actually helps to regulate. You might also want to consider as part of that the target cells, but what we're really after right now is just, the information regarding the behavior, the overall behavior that hormone helps to coordinate.